I've been reading this book by Ian McGilchrist called The Master and His Emissary. This book came highly recommended by a friend of mine from the Thousand Paths community, Tyler Bewley. He was on the Big Questions podcast, one of the first episodes that I recorded. Shout out to Tyler and Kirsten, beautiful wife, who's also on the podcast. Anyway, I've been reading this book and I'm probably about halfway through at this point. It's taken me a long time to get there, simply because it's extremely dense, and not in a bad way, not in a college textbook kind of way. It's compelling, and I can't stop reading, but I just can't read it quickly. That's the problem. I'm trying to absorb as much of the salient information as I can, and trust me when I say this, folks, there is a lot of salient information in this book. Now, the book is about the nature of the bihemispheric brain. I know that sounds really exciting, doesn't it? But it is. It's not just about that. It's about how the nature of the bihemispheric brain has shaped the very world we live in. And it actually goes a long way to explain some of the problems that I perceive in the world. And it also helped me to frame some of the mystical and spiritual experiences that I've had in my own life. So essentially, what I am picking up from this book is that the notion of the left brain being rational and the right brain being creative is bullshit. Oversimplification, distortion, not accurate. But like all inaccuracies, there is a shred of truth there. The left and the right hemispheres operate very differently. And in fact, what McGilchrist proves or attempts to prove in this book is that each hemisphere creates a different version of the world. The right hemisphere has one take on it. The left hemisphere has another take on it. And as you can imagine, those takes are very different. To give you an example, the left hemisphere is focused primarily on specifics. It likes to narrow in on segments or sections or pieces. It assembles the world from the bottom up, bit by bit, piecing things together. In contrast, the right brain approaches the big picture as a singular whole. Rather than being focused on the content, the right brain is primarily focused on the context, that is, the supporting, surrounding material. Rather than viewing things in isolation, the right brain views things as intrinsically connected. And whereas the left brain is always approaching a situation with a desire to control and exert influence, the right brain approaches the situation with an attitude of caring. Based on this alone, you might correctly guess that the right hemisphere is the one that is predominantly used in any kind of social interaction. It's the most interconnected hemisphere, and it also has the highest number of mirror neurons. And mirror neurons, of course, are the ones that fire the same way regardless of whether something happens to you or another. So if you observe something happening to someone else, those mirror neurons are going to fire the same way as if that thing had happened to you. So yes, a driver of empathy, and maybe the very source of empathy, to be honest with you. The ability to put yourself in another person's shoes, to imagine how they might feel, what is also known as the theory of mind, trying to guess what another person is thinking and trying to guess how their mind works. All of these things are rooted in the right hemisphere. The most fascinating thing to me, though, is the fact that the right hemisphere really assembles the world that we experience. Everything starts with the right hemisphere. It puts together the picture of reality that you experience. That is assembled by the right hemisphere. Then it's passed on to the left hemisphere, which goes through it and analyzes and breaks it down into pieces and labels each piece and seeks to understand, if you will, in the intellectual way, the world around it. I like what McGilchrist says in his book, the term that he uses. He says that the right hemisphere presents the world and the left hemisphere represents the world. So the problem with the left hemisphere is that it thinks that its representation of the world is the world itself. Again, you might be sensing a familiar theme. I often talk about the importance of seeing labels for what they are, seeing abstract categorizations for what they are, seeing conventions, whether they're linguistic or social, for what they are. And that is to say that they're not real in any meaningful sense. They are inventions. They help us. They're tools for manipulating the world around us and even ourselves. But they are not facets of reality. And the right hemisphere totally gets that. The right hemisphere is not silent, as some scientists have suggested. It does have access to language, but of course it uses language very differently. Whereas the left side is all about looking at things literally, the right brain, the right hemisphere, is all about metaphor and symbolism. See, it understands the proper use of language, understands in a way that is direct, not abstract and cognitive. The right hemisphere uses language properly as a tool for communicating meaning, and it doesn't get lost in the language, it just uses the language. So you see there's a very big difference there. When we get lost in concepts, when we start to think that labels are actual real things, that's the left hemisphere convincing itself that it knows everything it needs to know and that its version of reality is the only version. But as this book points out, and as I have experienced firsthand, there is another vision of reality created by the right hemisphere. And it is this vision that we must return to in order to become whole, complete, functional human beings. The left hemisphere is always trying to fix things. And that's what you do when you label a thing. When you label something, it becomes that label and it doesn't change anymore. Yet the right hemisphere and even scientists now know that nothing is fixed. Everything is in constant motion, movement, transformation. And that includes not only ourselves as humans, not only all life forms, but even inanimate objects like rocks, dirt, and all that kind of stuff. Those things are constantly changing and moving too. We just can't see it with our weak-ass senses. So with the two hemispheres, what we have is the original vision of the world produced by the right hemisphere, and then we have its representation through the left hemisphere. So to me, as a layman, as someone who doesn't have a PhD in neuroscience, I kind of see that as the limitation of language. You know, eventually you get to a point where the sequential, bit by bit, literal linguistic part of you is capped. You just can't go any further. You've reached the maximum development. All the faculties associated with the left hemisphere have limits. But the right hemisphere's vision of the world is limitless because it's not bound by labels. It is open to what is. The moment we label a thing and the moment we fix it in our minds, it ceases to exist in reality and it becomes an abstraction and we stop seeing it for what it actually is. One of the stories that I've told in the past is about how the entire world transformed for me on the day of my cubicle epiphany. I had this flash of wordless insight, this experience that I couldn't describe or understand, and right after that experience, everything was different. I saw the trees differently. I heard the birds differently. It was like I was seeing and hearing these things for the first time. And in the light of this book, it makes perfect sense to me. The reason I felt this way is because all my life I'd been interacting with the concept of things. I didn't see things as they were. I saw their concept. So when I walked by a tree, I didn't see the tree. I saw the concept of a tree. I was rooted in the left hemisphere in a way, and I wasn't actually experiencing things in their fullness. I wasn't experiencing things as they were. I was just dismissing them because they were not there. They were just abstractions. They were labels. They were fixed. They were concepts. Now more than ever, I think I'm starting to understand the nature of my cubicle epiphany. I'm starting to understand it physiologically, as in what happened physically in my body to cause this event, to cause this experience. And I think that the left hemisphere and its tools, when used properly, can be used to undermine the left hemisphere itself. I think that we can use language to transcend language. I think that we can use concepts to transcend concepts. And what happens is when we do that, we basically propel ourselves out of the left hemisphere and back into the right hemisphere. And for many of us, this is the first time we go there since we were very, very young, like little babies, little kids, right? Because as soon as we develop language, I think we start to live in the left hemisphere and we forget about the right hemisphere. And hey, guess what? I got a bit more time to drive, so I'm going to tie this all back to another one of my favorite metaphors. The Garden of Eden is essentially, in my opinion, a symbolic retelling of this shift from right hemisphere to left hemisphere. This applies both to our species as a whole and to the individual. Because as a species, we used to live in the animal world of the present. There were no abstractions. There were no symbolic languages, no concepts that we could lose sight of. Because as a species, we used to be right hemispheric creatures. We used to live in the now. We used to be connected. We used to feel as if we were part of the universe. And we didn't see much of a distinction between ourselves and the world around us. Like, for instance, if a saber-toothed tiger came out of the bushes, it's not like we were like, it's all one, man. We were creatures of instinct, but we were predominantly right hemispheric. But then as we began to develop music, and as that began to evolve into symbolic, conventional language, because music most likely came first, my friends, another thing that I learned in this book, as we began to develop that language, we moved gradually away from a right hemispheric world and we became lost in the left hemisphere. And this is what happens to us when we're kids. When we're born, we have no language. The left hemisphere is underdeveloped. And what happens is babies can't even distinguish between themselves and their parents. And that's why when you have a toddler or a very young child and you show them pictures of yourself, they think that that's them. When my girls were little, they would see a picture of my wife and they would say, that's me. Isn't that beautiful? They can't tell the difference. And quite frankly, I wish I couldn't tell the difference either. It's a beautiful world when you have this feeling of oneness. And most people have to fight to get there. Most people have to work to get there. And as children, we just are born into it. It's pretty fascinating. So the Garden of Eden is a symbolic commemoration of this moment, whether as an individual or as a species. This shift from living in the bliss, the interconnected present of the right hemispheric vision of the world, and into the left hemispheric world, which is the world that we live in now, the world that we've created for ourselves, the world of functionality and optimization, the world of manipulation and influence. And don't get me wrong, it's pretty amazing what we can do to the world and what we can do to each other with the left hemisphere. Modern medicine, skyscrapers, transportation, all the things that we've invented are rooted in the left hemisphere. They're not strictly a product of the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere is involved in all of this. But what I mean is that the tools of the left hemisphere are the things that allow us to manipulate and alter the world around us. So that's the whole meaning behind the book's title, The Master and His Emissary. McGilchrist argues that the right hemisphere is the master. The left hemisphere, with its many useful tools, is supposed to be the servant or the emissary. But somehow, the emissary has usurped the master. And now we are being run by the left hemisphere, which was never meant to be in charge of anything. It doesn't have the ability to be in charge of anything. It's got a very, very narrow focus, a very specialized niche set of functions. And it's not meant for steering the ship. What we need is the right hemisphere, the master, to be in charge. And I think when I had my cubicle epiphany, what happened is I was thinking about things, and those thoughts led me into the beautiful garden of the right hemisphere. And when I set foot into that clearing and I beheld the beauty, I was struck speechless. And after I left my office that day and I looked at the tree, I no longer saw a tree. I saw God. I saw oneness. And I saw this unique, beautiful manifestation of the one. My friends, I'm running out of time right now, and I don't know if I'm making a lot of sense. I highly recommend this book, obviously, but I don't know if it'll have the same impact on you. For me, it's just putting all of these pieces together. It's connecting all the dots that before were disconnected. So it's an amazing book. And, you know, if you don't read it, I hope you'll at least consider the theory that there are two competing visions of the world happening inside of you right now. And if you're observant, you'll see how very different these visions are and how they influence you in different ways. The us versus them mentality is rooted in the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere is empathetic. It's interconnected and it seeks connections. If you can step into the right hemisphere, or if you can move towards the right hemisphere a bit more, you'll see that the world will transform. Things will change, despite the fact that they won't change in reality. Your perception of these things will change, and it's going to have a huge, huge impact on you. A positive impact, I hope. All right, well, I'm going to head up into the office now and put in a solid shift. So thanks for joining me, and thanks for entertaining me while I rant and ramble. And I hope that you'll join me again. Till next time, live well.